And thank you for joining us today. My name is Donnell Keach. I'm going to be your moderator for today's session, so introducing your panelists and kind of helping with the flow of things. I am the Resilient Forest Program Director for the Maryland, DC chapter of the Nature Conservancy. I'm based in Cumberland, Maryland, and direct our forest conservation work here in coordination with my colleagues in other states working across the Central Appalachians. We're going to get started with just a couple of housekeeping items to make sure we're all ready to go. So this is pretty standard stuff if you're doing a lot of webinars, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. All of you have been muted on entry. It's not because we don't appreciate you and your voices. It's just to help make sure that our sound quality is good here. These sessions, each of the webinars in this series are being recorded and will be posted online at the web address that you see there, and you're also receiving emails as a registered attendee. You'll be receiving follow-up emails with this information. Please use the chat box if you need help, if you're having trouble hearing, if you're having some kind of technical issue. We have two colleagues, Sabrina and Monique, who are running on this whole thing behind the scenes and are there monitoring the chat to help you if you run into trouble. Questions for the panelists can be submitted anytime via the Q&A feature that you see next to the chat. So chat for technical support, Q&A for questions and answers. We will be doing questions at the end of the webinar, but you can enter them into that Q&A feature at any time. And finally, we're going to use the polling feature of Zoom a couple times today, and actually we're going to start with that right now and do a little poll. So just take a few minutes and tell us something about who you're with and where you're at there. We'll just take a minute to let y'all look at that. You just click on that radio button. It's pretty straightforward. I think many of us, particularly in these days of global pandemic, are getting pretty experienced with Zoom. We have a total of 75 participants on the line with us today, and in just a second, they're going to show us, yeah, most of us, no big shocker, most of us are logging in here alone today. I think we have one more polling question to give us a sense of who's on the line with us today. So again, just take a minute, look at the questions there, and you'll check the radio buttons as soon as the poll pops up. There you go. You can check more than one. So if you fall into more than one of these categories, you don't have to choose just one. We'll just take another minute here and see kind of who we have with us today. Maybe one more second and we'll see the poll results. Oh, interesting. All right, so thanks to about a third of us are here from the environmental community, a little over a third are with a government agency, and a nice smattering of some of these other categories. Terrific. All right, thank you so much for participating in that poll. So as I mentioned, this webinar is the second in a series. We hope that you will be able to join us for additional sessions. If you missed the June 2nd session, we have a typo on this slide here. So the first one was on June 2nd. That one is already passed. We are here today on June 9th. And the sessions are being recorded and posted to the marylandcleanenergy.org/biomass website. So if you missed one, or if you want to tell a friend about it and give them a chance to watch some of the sessions, you can do that. Webinar attendees can receive one continuing forestry education credit from the Society of American Foresters for each of these webinar sessions that you attend. And other credential holders may be able to self-report this series to meet continuing educational requirements. So if that's something that's relevant to you, we hope you'll take advantage of that. At the end of today's session, as you close the Zoom webinar meeting, a survey page is automatically going to open in your browser window. And we hope that you will complete this. It will be helpful to you in giving us the correct information if you are going to go on and apply for that continuing education credit. But it also just helps us get some feedback on who participated today, what value you found in the session, and it'll help us continue to tweak these webinar sessions going forward. And if you need any information or any assistance in reporting your continuing education hours, you can email info@marylandcleanenergy.org. Okay? So with that, we just need to thank our sponsors and partners here, and then we'll be ready to get started. This program is being offered in association with the Spurring Fossil-Free Biomass Initiative, brought to you by the Maryland Forest Foundation, the Maryland Clean Energy Center, and is in partnership with the Maryland DNR, Department of Natural Resources, the Sustainable Forestry Council, of which I am a member. This is how I connect to this. With funding from the Maryland Agricultural Education and Rural Development Assistance Fund, MARDAF, and the Rural Maryland Council. So thank you all so much, and let's get going. So we have a great lineup of speakers today. As I mentioned, we are going to have time for Q&A at the end, but you can put in those questions as they occur to you as we're going through in the Q&A feature. Today we're going to hope to give you an understanding of how enabling markets for low-value wood can be used for biomass energy and can improve forest health, create jobs, keep forests working to sequester carbon. So we're going to be hearing from a number of experts to help us dive into how that can happen and how we can work together to make that happen. So our first speaker is actually joining us by pre-recorded video, a video segment. Secretary Kelly M. Schultz, Secretary of the Maryland Department of Commerce. Secretary Schultz brings a wealth of knowledge to the Maryland Department of Commerce from her years of experience working in government, private sector, and as a small business owner. She served previously as the Secretary of Maryland's Department of Labor, Licensing, and Regulation. And she's also a former member of Maryland's House of Delegates. She represented Frederick County and served on the Economic Matters Committee during her time as a delegate. Prior to embarking on a career of public service, Secretary Schultz sold real estate, worked as a program manager for a defense contractor, and was part owner of a cybersecurity firm. Secretary Schultz has attained her associate's degree from Monroe Community College in Rochester, New York, and later a bachelor's of arts in political science from Hood College in Frederick, Maryland. So with that, we will hear from Secretary Schultz via a pre-recorded video message.
Go. Hello, I'm Kelly Schultz, Maryland Secretary of Commerce. Welcome to the webinar, and I hope you and your families are safe and healthy. I want to thank you for joining us today, and I want to thank Kathy Magruder and the Maryland Clean Energy Center team for organizing the webinar and inviting me to join in. Right now, Governor Hogan and all of us in Maryland government are focused on safely reopening the state's economy and working hard to put the COVID crisis behind us. But we're not losing sight of Maryland's other priorities, including Governor Hogan's clean energy goals and supporting Maryland's forestry sector. Biomass energy can and will be a part of addressing these challenges. The timber industry is vitally important to Maryland. It offers significant employment opportunities from across the state, from Oakland to Ocean City, and particularly for Marylanders who live in rural areas. So I'm very pleased to see a strong collaboration between the state, industry, and our nonprofits to use biomass to find new, clean energy solutions. We know this is a challenging time for our state's timber industry, but the Department of Commerce is actively working to stabilize, then grow Maryland's forest products sector. Together with the Western Maryland Resource Conservation and Development Council, the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and others, we are using a federal grant to develop an economic adjustment strategy for Maryland's forest products sector. The goal is to help to mitigate the economic downturn in the industry, consider the unique strengths and assets in each area of the state, and develop a plan for retaining and growing this sector in the years to come. We're constantly discovering new opportunities for forestry in Maryland and exploring them with our economic development partners across the state. Today's conversation will focus on biomass, where the timber and energy industries converge. It's an area where Maryland has great potential. Perhaps this webinar can help kickstart some new projects in this area. I look forward to hearing a lot of great new ideas. We at the Department of Commerce are excited to move forward with Maryland forestry industry.
All right. So we thank Secretary Schultz, and even though she's not with us live in person, if you have a question that you would like to direct to her, I would encourage you to still type it into the Q&A. Any questions that we can't answer in the course of today's live session, we will try to get and share answers back out to you after the webinar is concluded today. So thanks to Secretary Schultz. Our next speaker is Wade Haerle. Wade is the Agriculture and Energy Program Manager with the Maryland Department of Commerce, under Secretary Schultz's leadership. Wade has extensive experience in the development of energy projects at the local, state, and national levels, with an emphasis on the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Wade has worked on over 200 NEPA permits in the 18 western states, plus projects in Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Additionally, Wade has worked on forest health issues in Colorado for over 25 years. Wade works for the Maryland Department of Commerce, I already said that, as the Program Manager for Agriculture and Energy, and he lives on the Eastern Shore in Y Mills, Maryland. Welcome, Wade, and take it away. I believe Wade was not able to join us with a video feed, and he's not going to have slides, but he's got a lot of interesting things to say. So thanks, Wade. Take it away.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. And I also want to thank the Maryland Clean Energy Center, Catherine Magruder, for allowing me to speak today, and Sabrina Bachman for all her help. I'm not allowed to use Zoom as a state employee, so the technical issues were taken away from us, but Sabrina's been a huge help. Both of them are just simply good people. I was asked to speak about energy economics and to keep the comments at the 30,000-foot level. So here we go. So it's a simple economic philosophy for me, but I have found people will help you solve your problems and help you meet your challenges if you let them make money. One of our problems in Maryland is forest health. Like many states, it's a situation where never in our history have we had more trees, yet less healthy forests. We have many of the same trees in the same areas that are also the same age. This is not an ideal situation by any stretch. So that's our problem. Our challenge from Governor Hogan, of course, is we need to be 50% reliant on renewable energy by 2030 and 100% by 2024. So the goal is looking at wood for energy, specifically thermal and localized. We could allow the timber sector of our economy to make money, improve our forest health through active management, diversifying the species by species and by age, and meet Maryland's renewable energy goals. And as a bonus, healthier forests will result in a better water quality and water quantity flowing in our rivers and into the Chesapeake Bay. Today, I will frame how economic decisions are made around energy in general, with the goal of inspiring ideas for biomass in particular. First, some of the newest information on where we are in the United States in regards to energy output. So from this month, from the Energy Information Administration, for the first time in 135 years, renewables have overtaken coal in regards to BTU consumed in the United States. It's 11.5 quadrillion BTUs of renewables compared to 11.3 quadrillion BTUs of coal for those keeping score. Again, first time in 135 years. The leaders for renewables in BTU output are wind, hydro, wood, and biofuels, with actually solar today being in last place, but growing along with wind, solar is showing strong growth. Hydro, wood, and biofuels are relatively flat in regards to BTU output. Collectively, renewables have grown from 8% of our energy output to 11% of our energy output over the past 10 years. Before we look at the economics of wood and biomass, let's first understand the economic issues and decision-making around energy and electricity itself. The market for electricity is between $30 and $50 per megawatt hour. So if you started a facility that was 15 megawatts of base load power, your revenue per year would be $4 million minimum. Easy decision to make, right? You can make a lot of money. That's again 15 megawatts at $30 to $50 per megawatt hours, 4 million minimum per year. But the energy business is not only, in the energy business, not only do you need a permit from the Maryland Public Service Commission, you need a social license from the citizens of Maryland. Every fuel source that is part of the energy sector must earn its social license to operate every day. All forms of energy have its challenges in obtaining the social license. You can, questions you're going to ask are, can you get the facility permitted? How long will it take for the regulators to make that decision on a permit? And what is the certainty the permitting decision will be a yes? These social license questions are key economic drivers and can't be ignored. And if an energy source messes up in one locale, it impacts the social licenses in all locales. So here are the economic and environmental considerations for each fuel choice. Wood and biomass. It's plentiful, it's everywhere. It's dense in regard to energy BTU output. It's non-volatile. And it's easy to know whose is whose, and it's easy to transport. You can put it in a wheelbarrow and you can get it out of your yard. It can be localized to specific energy requirements. It's great for thermal uses and steam. The problem is carbon and smoke, and it's not optimal for large-scale power plants. From the environmental standpoint, it's actually positive. Again, you can have active forest management to obtain wood biomass and improve the environment. And from a permitting standpoint, you can be localized thermal projects can be easily permitted. So let's jump down to coal. It's plentiful. It's denser than wood. It's non-volatile, and it's easy to know whose is whose. And it's easy to transport, and you can transport it long distances. The problem, it's not everywhere, and it does not burn clean. And it also, and this is important, it's not an instant on and off on the electrical supply, but is good for large-scale load of electricity. Also, the other problems is you need mining. You need strip mining. You can have regular mining, mountain topping, those kinds of problems. And then also in permitting, it's 8 years minimum to permit a coal-fired power plant, and there is zero certainty that the answer will be yes for your permit for either a mine or a power plant, limiting your chance to make that decision. Oil is plentiful. It's dense. It's harder to know whose is whose, but it can be bottled and it can be put in a barrel. It can be shipped long distances. Oil also has demand from many sectors because it has multiple uses and it's used for other things. Problem, it's more volatile than coal. You also have transportation safety issues with trains, trucks, pipelines, and ships. And it's hard to get out of the ground. Environmentally, you need a drill rig and a location with oil, which is usually where the great rivers meet the ocean. Permitting. Drilling, yes, with great certainty you can get a permit. A power plant, no one is really doing it anymore. It's old technology, but a place like Hawaii is very dependent on oil for electricity. Natural gas, plentiful, everywhere, dense, burns cleaner than wood and coal and petroleum. Also, this is very important, it's instant on and off in the electric grid. If you need it, you can turn it on and it's right there, almost on demand. It can also be localized, used in a home for heat, and in a business park for CHP and other uses. Problem, natural gas is more volatile. That's why we add chemicals to it to make it smell like rotten eggs. Hard to know whose is whose, hard to transport. It's got to be in a pipeline, it's got to be compressed in trucks or on boats. It's hard to get out of the ground. Environmentally, you need a drilling rig. Permitting, yes. You can drill with great certainty and get a permit for that. Power plants, yes. All you need is a substation and a transmission line, and I can get you a permit in 6 months. Natural gas is the fastest growing energy source by far. Have you noticed the trend? The cleaner the fossil fuel, the more volatile the product, and the harder it is to transport. So we will skip over hydrogen quickly. 80% of hydrogen's uses is on-site for specific manufacturing purposes. They create hydrogen where it's going to be used. There's little to no transportation. Nuclear power, dense, no emissions, renewable, and is the perfect fuel source if you ignore your history. And then also there's a little radioactive half-life for the waste product that is longer than the recorded history of the world. Permitting, not on the horizon for new plants, but existing plants are being relicensed. There is no social license in sight for a new nuclear power plant. Wind. Wind is renewable, no emissions, but it is not dense. It can be localized. Cannot be used for thermal. Facilities are outside, therefore need more maintenance and must be replaced every 10 to 20 years. Windmills need some backup power supply. Environmentally, lots of energy, the lack of energy density requires lots of land and lots of space. Also requires mining for components, steel, and concrete, and specifically at each site for a windmill. Permitting. Although wind is the popular kid right now, it is becoming very hard to permit. Wind is like affordable housing. Everybody is for it until you tell them where you're going to locate it. Solar. Renewable, no emissions, and can be very localized. I'm in my second home with solar panels on the roof. It is not dense. It needs an unbelievable amount of land for large scale use. Solar is also passive, low voltage, and does not travel well in regards to the transmission lines. It is also outside, and solar must be backed up. Environmentally, many mining of rare earth minerals, and it takes a lot of energy to produce silicon. Permitting. Easier than wind for a large scale, but it is also becoming harder. Localized permitting can be hit or miss. Solar panels on a roof can be stopped simply by a neighborhood code. Hydro is renewable, it's dense, it's clean, zero emissions, and can be base load power, or it can be peaking power. Environmentally, there's no argument about it. That a hydro plant changes the environment on both sides of the dam. Can be either the good or bad of that can be debated, but the environment is definitely changed. Permitting. A new dam is difficult, it can take decades, and there is no certainty. But 60% of the existing dams and impoundments in the United States are without a hydro component. So there could be opportunities where you already have an impact to add hydro someday. So those are the choices. Which fuel will you pick? Which fuel has the market picked? That answer is simple. The market today has picked natural gas. Coal has lost its social license and it's lost the market. Wind and solar are popular, but localized opposition is growing. So now let's look at wood and wood biomass. Again, the benefits. It's dense, it's non-volatile, and it's great for localized and site-specific use. Also, wood allows for local primary jobs. And the profits also stay local with the companies that are producing the wood biomass. So, and also because the localized is great for projects, especially campus environments, office parks, and it can also be used for thermal heat and steam with the wood as the fuel source. So what are the challenges? Wood has a complicated social contract when you look at the history. From the late 1980s until we ran many of the timber mills out of business, timber was as unpopular as coal is today. The term below-cost timber and the spotted owl were weekly stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The social contract today is better for wood, but there are still issues, and those issues still impact the use of wood today. The other challenge we have is finding champions for a project. Wood and wood biomass have upfront expenses with long-term benefits. That's not a shock. But when you look at higher education campuses or government office complex, the challenge for finding a champion of wood and wood biomass projects, waiting on those long-term benefits down the road is a difficult issue. The leaders may be gone before the benefits show up. It's an issue that needs to be looked at, and it's an issue that needs to be mitigated. So biomass is not only biomass is the only energy source that I can think of that has the ability to improve the environment, namely forest health. With good forest management practices, biomass has the potential to return Maryland forests back to a more natural state with a proper diversity of species of trees and diversity of age. And again, better water quality and better water quantity in our rivers will eventually impact positively the Chesapeake Bay. Biomass can be, should be, and hopefully will be part of Maryland's energy solutions and to help Governor Hogan meet the aggressive renewable energy goals. And with that, those are my prepared remarks.
All right, thank you so much, Wade. That was a lot of information, but it very well presented. I was able to follow it even without slides. Do you think that it is the economic and environmental considerations, sort of that compare and contrast that you offered of all of those different energy sources, is that something that's available on a website or something that you might be able to follow up with for folks who want to kind of sit with what you provided?
I just wrote it out,
Yeah.
so I can send the notes, but yeah, it's I don't think I said anything too offensive, so yeah, I can send it out.
Well, we'll follow up about that, but that was one thing I jotted down as we were talking. Keep those questions and answers coming in, folks. Those questions coming in, and we'll get to the answers at the end, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we're up to 97 participants, so welcome to folks who may have joined after our formal opening, and welcome. We're glad that everyone's here. Our next speaker is going to be Brian Kittler. Brian is the Senior Director of Forest Restoration with the nonprofit organization American Forests. Brian leads American Forest policy and landscape scale initiatives in the Western U.S. Prior to joining American Forests, he led the forest teams at Sustainable Northwest and at the Pinchot Institute for Conservation, focused on federal forest management, collaborative conservation, community forests, and forest carbon markets and incentives. Brian's work has also focused on forest bioenergy sustainable analysis. This has included studies for the University of Maryland's Hughes Center for Agroecology in Y Mills, where Wade is located, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities, and the European Commission, as well as collaborations with the International Energy Agency, Bioenergy. This research that he's done pertains to wood sourcing programs and certifications, international trade, sustainability criteria, and carbon analysis. Brian is also currently a member of the Technical Advisory Committee for the California Biopower Impacts Project, and he's a consultant to the Washington State Carbon Sequestration Advisory Group. Brian has a bachelor's from Colby College in environmental policy and a master's degree in MS, Master's of Science, in environmental science and policy from Johns Hopkins University. So with that, Brian, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Great. Just wait for my presentation to come up. Can everyone see me okay? Hear me okay?
You're sounding and looking good, and we're waiting to see your slides.
Great. Thanks. Well, this is as those come up, I'll introduce myself and American Forests. American Forests, we're the nation's first forest conservation nonprofit organization, dating back almost 150 years. And in that time, we've been involved in a number of different things with sustainable forestry and sustainable forest as the core of what we do. But really, it's about investing in forests as a part of American society, from city center all the way to the top of mountains, where I work in the Western U.S. So very excited to be talking about one of my favorite topics, forest bioenergy, today. American Forest has not done a lot on forest bioenergy recently, save for our engagement with the Forest Climate Working Group, which is the largest forest sector coalition on climate and forest carbon in the country. That forest bioenergy has been a recent topic of conversation and a welcome topic of conversation since that group has not talked about it in say the last 10 years or so. At any rate, I want to start by just asking the basic framing question: are forest bioenergy and conservation compatible? And most of what I'm going to be talking about today will be a roundabout way of answering that question, hopefully. So first item I want to address here, let's start with the basic issue to reconcile with. Number one issue in conservation related to forests. We need to maintain forest cover, keeping forests as forests. Markets are extremely important for that, both high value markets and low value markets like energy. Currently, the state of Maryland does have traditionally several high value markets. I think it was back in the early 2000s. Forest to Market, which is a for-profit consulting company that tracks forest product markets and the forestry sector, identified that Maryland, out of all the states in the country, had the highest value per acre output of any forest products sector in the country. So pretty impressive there. At the same time, the state has traditionally struggled with maintaining low value markets. Pulp and paper has always been there, but it's been receding in recent years. So there's been this interest in bioenergy as a way to come in and supplement that bottom rung of the market. But that being said, scale really matters in terms of sustainability. A market that is not scaled to the available resource will be inherently unsustainable. You can't supply, you can't meet that, that demand if you don't have the resource. At the same time, if a market is too small, then the positive elements, the positive benefits that forest landowners, forest managers, and broader society would expect to see from a market won't materialize. Something I really want to drill home, core to the aspect of forest sustainability is sustainable forest management. And there's many ways to define SFM, but at its core, it's essentially doing right by the forest, harnessing its basic capacity to regenerate. You don't want to remove more than can grow back, and you want to ensure that what you do remove does grow back. There's other elements to it though. You have to incorporate wildlife, water quality, and forestry over time has evolved a set of practices and an approach that really does that. Forest health increasingly is a focus of sustainable forest management. We're facing forest health crises across the country in dramatic fashion. The state of California, for instance, has 162 million dead trees at this moment, much associated with changes that we're seeing associated with climate change. SFM increasingly is factoring in climate effects that we're experiencing now and will be seeing in the future, one of which is increased tree mortality, and we are seeing some of that in the state of Maryland. Lastly, sustainable forest management just isn't contained to the woods itself. It's global in the sense, trade in forest products is global, and also the interactions with the atmosphere. Atmospheric carbon is an essential aspect of forest management, and something that I think will be becoming a greater focus well into the future. Next slide, please. So just stepping back real quick, I want to just take it down to the ground level in the state here. We've got 2.4 million acres of forest land in the state of Maryland, most of which is private, although I will comment that the map here is probably one of the more diverse ownership maps of any state in the country. There's several different ownership categories, and each of these landowners has their own objectives and own interests in managing and owning forest land. I talked about that key metric of conservation, maintaining the forest cover. Since the 1960s, the state has lost more than 500,000 acres of forest. That is a very significant amount relative to the total area. And it continues at a slower rate though. We've seen about 20,000 acres lost in a 5-year period beginning in 2013. That said, there are significant opportunities in every state in the country, and including in Maryland, in reforestation. It's something that my organization has a significant focus on. And recently, partners of ours have completed an analysis looking at all the different opportunities for reforestation in the country. So adding forest back to the landscape. And Maryland has significant, turns out there's around 1 million acres, and there's probably going to be lots of debate about which acre is appropriate. But that being said, it is one mechanism by which you can add, diversify the age class of forest in the state through afforestation, reforestation. But as Wade alluded to, we have sort of this uneven age class distribution in the forests of Maryland. Forests keep adding inventory, but most of that is on the existing forests that are already there, most of which are older. Next slide, please. So we have a situation where most of the annual tree biomass that is gained is in this larger diameter grouping. It's in older forest. You see here in the bar chart showing in the inventory year of 2018, all the different forest type groups in the state of Maryland. The oak hickory group by far is the largest, and by far most of that is old, over 60 years, extending into after 100 years. A lot of those species can live a long time. That said, we don't see a lot of regeneration. Some of that is due to things like deer browse. Some of it's due to lack of forest management. Oak and pine is another significant group, as well as loblolly pine primarily, also some shortleaf. In that group, you can see a more even age class distribution. It tends to be a more actively managed component of the forest sector in Maryland. I do want to just highlight again, though, the significant lack or the amount of forest that is in that younger age class is pretty small. And that does raise some concerns related to early successional habitat as well. There are some opportunities there whereby which conservation objectives for wildlife habitat work pretty well with forestry objectives. So just wanted to make note of that. And that is going to be one topic of conversation we get to later in the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so here I want to focus on this chart. We see at a basic level on the balance in recent years, gross growth of tree biomass has dramatically outpaced on a scale of 2.3 to 1 the removals from timber harvesting and tree mortality in the state. So we have a net balance of about 94 million cubic feet. And that equals about 3.1 million green tons of wood added to the inventory every year. From a carbon perspective, it's significant. That's 2.9 million metric tons of carbon dioxide that's annually sequestered in Maryland's forests in new growth. And that's net growth. So that's subtracting out for removals and mortality. So we're adding more and more carbon every year. This is a very positive thing. And it's what we need to be looking at in terms of our climate effects. Incidentally, that same volume is approximately the volume that's emitted by Maryland homeowners burning petroleum to heat their homes or by natural gas-fired electricity power plants. So just an interesting metric that we can look at there. In terms of removals, we're averaging about 9,000 acres per year of forest in the state. Out of that 2.4 million, that's seeing some type of removal, whether that's through thinning or through a final harvest. So from a biomass supply perspective, just keep that in your heads. Next slide, please. In terms of forest health concerns, forest fragmentation and conversion, again, conversion is a big issue, but also is forest fragmentation. Generally, when forests are fragmented, they become more difficult to manage. The management constraints, the economic constraints become a real headache for forest managers. And generally under about 20 acres is where we start to see landowner interests in terms of active forest management really start to change. So you can see in the bar charts here kind of where we're at as far as the number of landowners in different parcel sizes in that top bar chart. And the bottom one roughly the parcel size distribution across all the family forests in the state of Maryland. So it's a big issue. High grading is quite damaging practice by which when timber is harvested, we take the best wood and we leave the worst, and leaves forest in a graded state in terms of the commercial and the ecological integrity of the forest for the next cycle of management. It is believed that diversifying markets, having that lower grade market, could actually help balance out those interests so that you are incentivizing a more even harvest between the different quality that is there in the forest in terms of the tree quality. Invasive species, certainly deer browse and regeneration, it's been a big headache, big issue. Tree mortality has increased slightly in the recent inventory. It's highlighted in Maryland's Forest Action Plan, and again, climate change. Next slide, please. I just want to pause and take a focus briefly on the softwood inventory in the state. You can see here in this map, loblolly pine is a stalwart feature on the Lower Eastern Shore and in Southern Maryland. The softwood inventory is increasing, but most of that volume gain is in low quality, low grade logs. We see in the bottom right bar chart, the saw timber in the highest grade is actually staying relatively consistent across years, but that lower grade wood is increasing. Most of that is actually a reflection that there's significant areas of loblolly that is naturally regenerated. And is not being actively managed nearly to the degree that it could. And some of that is due to poor or weakened markets. Another aspect of the softwood inventory that I want to focus on is that currently there's about 2.8 million metric tons of wood in the upper portion of loblolly and other softwoods in the state of Maryland. Typically, this is the segment of a tree that is used for the pulpwood market, whether that market for pulpwood goes into pulp and paper or packaging or panel products or to energy. So I just wanted to get that out there. Next slide, please. Another aspect of the component of Maryland's forest inventory that may have some interplay with biomass markets is cull, or what we're going to sort of define as rough live trees that may not be appropriate for higher value products, salvageable dead trees. So that being said, it is important to maintain deadwood in a forest ecosystem for a number of different reasons. Wildlife attributes in particular, but there are opportunities in forest management to remove some of this material and use it for energy products or pulpwood, and typically that's pulpwood products, and typically that's what's done. So just focusing on the component here in the pie chart that is the rough and poorly formed saw timber or pole timber, that equivalent cubic foot volume equals roughly about 4 million tons across the state of Maryland in the standing inventory. Then if you factor in the rough and poorly formed saw timber that's alive, it's adding another significant component of the inventory. So from a biomass market, this is something that we've seen in other states where it's been a component of harvest that has gone into that very low value market. And it gives you just a sense for the rough volume in the standing inventory that currently exists. Next slide, please. So one thing that, if we want to look at a finer scale assessment of potential supply for those categories that I just mentioned, including others. So if we look at the softwood inventory, we look at the hardwood inventory, we look at that cullwood, we look at the pulpwood component of a forest. What other potential available biomass supply is there out there? So 10 years ago, I was involved in a project that attempted to come up with some estimates of potentially available biomass supply at different price points. And what we did is we separated the state into 5 subregions, which bleed over economically into adjacent states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Virginia and West Virginia. And in looking at each of these subregions, which are essentially multiple county areas, we categorized this chart on the left, the forest-derived biomass for each of these subregions. We looked at the logging residues, available roundwood in both small diameter trees through that come out in a harvest through thinning or through cull and other material at final harvest. We looked at wood product residues, so this is all the fines and other materials coming out when a log is milled at a sawmill or used to manufacture other higher value wood products. And we also looked at urban wood waste, and this is everything from tree care operations to packaging, pallets, municipal solid waste, construction and demolition material. And we looked at a number of sources, three different sources, I believe, for the urban wood waste category in particular, because it is a very large component of the total woody biomass supply in the state of Maryland. Next slide, please. So we took some data from the U.S. Forest Service Forest Products Lab that was preparing at the time the billion-ton study, which is a study nationwide looking at available biomass resources. And we basically scaled that down to this 5-county area in the state of Maryland. In terms of forest-derived biomass, we made some judgment calls here, recognizing some of those factors I talked about earlier, the parcelization, landowner willingness to harvest. And we looked at 3 basic biomass supply levels, one in which landowners, all landowners are perfectly willing to harvest biomass, one at which landowners, we said, well, only about half of them would, and one at which we actually used research from Brett Butler, who runs the National Woodland Owner Survey for the Forest Service, to determine a likely volume of biomass. And so what you see here is those 3 levels, the lowest of which is the most likely scenario, at least to start, where about 20% of the forest owners would actively manage their forest and supply timber to the market, including woody biomass. So it gives you a sense of where we're at across the state of Maryland. About $50 per ton, we're seeing about 250,000 metric tons of biomass potentially available on an annual basis derived from forests in the state of Maryland. Next slide, please. As we look at the share of total biomass by subregion in each of these subregions that we define across the state, when the total available biomass from forest owners, where their willingness to harvest increases, so when we actually increase that in our analysis, we see the we see a shift in where the biomass was coming from. So to start, we saw central Maryland as being the largest source, and then we saw a shift as more landowners participate to more of the total biomass supply coming from Western Maryland. And that is assuming that we have higher volumes of biomass through more harvesting going on. And I just want to make clear, I don't think I explained this earlier, but the data set that we were deriving from Kent Skog and the Forest Service is looking at a scenario by which they're targeting forests that are in excess of their current recommended stand stocking level. So it's basically, what that translates to is a thinning scenario where you're thinning forests and or you're simulating final harvests that are going to reduce the total stand inventory across the state over time to a level at which is the idealized stocking level. So next slide, please. So when we factor in urban wood waste, forest-derived biomass, and mill residues, you can see the pie chart on the left here. The urban wood waste component is significant, and the Maryland DNR has looked into this a number of times and has a pretty good understanding of the potentially recoverable material there. The forest-derived biomass, again, that is assuming the lowest level of participation. If we have more landowners participating, that blue piece of the pie would grow. The mill residue component, that is one I want to highlight because, again, we did this study 10 years ago. There's been a lot of changes in the forest product sector. That segment, that slice of the pie could essentially be larger or smaller at this point, depending on what the situation is. Looking at the line graph here at different price points for a green ton of biomass, at about $50 per ton, it sort of levels out across the state, where we're going to see about 1.13 million metric tons available on a sustainable basis across the state, based on the assumptions that we looked at. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a lot of wood out there. There's a lot of potentially recoverable biomass. What does that mean in terms of energy? So the next step of what we looked at was taking each available subregion's available biomass, translating that into potential output in energy technologies. So we looked at biopower potential, that's electricity-only power plants. We looked at combined heat and power through combustion, and CHP through gasification, which is slightly more efficient or significantly more efficient depending on the technology. We looked at direct thermal energy, and we looked at densifying biomass in wood pellets. So we translated the volume available at $50 per ton, because that's essentially where we go flat in our supply. And we looked at that and then translated that in each subregion and across the state for the total potential output of energy. So we see, for instance, in Western Maryland, potential available annual sustainable supply based on the factors that we looked at, you could produce about 24 megawatts of electricity power. Combined heat and power, you could do about 11 megawatts, as well as over 317,000 million BTUs of heat. And it sort of goes on and on and on and on. So you can sort of see the way that we thought about this question about what's potentially available, what you could utilize it for. And then that allows us to then start to ask other questions, like if we want to reduce emissions, which approach makes the most sense? If we want to support forest landowners as a larger component of the supply, which of these technologies would we look to? And I should mention, and just be clear, this total available biomass supply, again, is assuming that you can use that full volume of urban wood waste, which there's a lot of uncertainty there, as well as a lot of uncertainty about what's available from forest lands. Next slide, please. Really want to hammer this point home that efficiency really, really matters. With 1 million tons, you've got some choices. You could be looking at high efficiency, 80 to 90% efficient energy conversion technologies, or something around 25 to 30% if you just want to produce electricity. Given Maryland's available biomass supply, the thermal technologies make a lot of sense. They also make a lot of sense in terms of keeping energy dollars local, and they make a lot of sense from an application perspective. Heat is the most efficient use of the wood, and there's a lot of need for heat. On the left here, you can see the type of different products. I know a later webinar is going to get into this. The type of different utilization technologies and the average heat output and the average biomass consumed on an annual basis. I want to focus on the bottom line here, the Eastern Correctional Institute. This is the prison complex on the Eastern Shore that had a combined heat and power plant, 4 megawatt facility, which largely was fired by wood chips from thinning and final harvest of loblolly pine stands. That was consuming about 50 to 65 million tons of greenwood per year. A decision was made that it would be converting over to natural gas here, which is going to have a significant impact on forest lands and forest management in that part of the state. And think back to that chart I showed earlier about that volume of low quality wood in that inventory on the lower Eastern Shore. So that's a place potentially where a biomass market makes a lot of sense. Next slide. I just want to wrap up here, focusing on the carbon side of this. My colleague Kendall DeLeiser in the next webinar is going to be getting into this at a higher level, but just want to touch on some basic principles here. Most studies identify that there is a temporal imbalance between when you emit the carbon at a bioenergy facility and when the subsequent sequestration occurs. This is based on several years of research looking at all the different studies that have been done across, really across the globe. But really, I just want to mention that it all depends on your analytical assumptions, your approach, and the framing of the issue. You can get any number of questions, or any number of answers depending on how you frame the questions. Due to its comparatively lower energy density, wood combustion does initially emit more CO2 per unit energy when compared to fossil fuels. Most studies do find that forest bioenergy offers long-term reductions in CO2 emissions relative to fossil fuels. So just want to highlight that by and large, most of the studies that have been done do find conclusive evidence that bioenergy is a better thing for the climate than traditional fossil fuels. The magnitude of benefits and the time until they are realized, however, depend on the efficiency of the technology, the reference energy system that is being replaced and its fuel, the forest management types or practices, a type of biomass feedstock that's used, whether that's something that's currently not utilized in other markets or something that is, the landscape effects, what's going on in terms of carbon sequestration, market effects, is the demand for biomass changing the extent of forest based on precipitating a price signal that landowners are going to respond to and maybe either plant more or manage more. So it gets very complex, but key take home here is that most studies do recognize that there are benefits over a certain period of time. Next slide, please. So the good news is that in Maryland, as I highlighted before, based on the biomass supply that's available, based on the type of forest management that is needed, and the technology that matches best with that, we actually have an opportunity for thermal and CHP in the state of Maryland, which can offer very significant and climate benefits in a relatively short amount of time. So there was a study that was done, and I believe Maura Adams with the Northern Forest Center presented in the last webinar potentially about this, but the study that was done in the Northern Forest region where they looked at wood pellets that are produced in that region comprised mainly of low quality pulpwood and residue material sawdust from local sawmills. And what they found when they ran the numbers, they looked at the forest management effects in the ecosystem, as well as all those other factors that go into a life cycle analysis of bioenergy. They looked at all the numbers, and they found that wood pellets, the bioenergy scenario is superior to all fossil fuel scenarios. So you can see this in the bar chart here, and that includes natural gas. And that includes when you factor in distribution losses associated with methane release of natural gas in the transmission system. So this is good news for the forest sector in the northeast states, and potentially good news for the state of Maryland as it refines its biomass and bioenergy ambitions. Next slide. Well, thank you. This image is actually not Maryland, but I'd like to end on it because it's beautiful, and look forward to any of your questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Brian, for all of that great information and the great graphics. Will it be easy for people to find some of the reports that you've referenced in this presentation?
Yes.
Okay.
There's a report on the Pinchot Institute for Conservation's website, my former organization that I referenced. Most of the supply information came from, but I'd be happy to follow up with anyone with more up-to-date information too.
Terrific. If there's just a couple links that would get people started, maybe we can include them in the post-webinar Q&A push out. All right, fantastic. Thanks again, Brian. So our final speaker for today, before we have some time for your questions, is Dr. David Ware. Dr. Ware is a non-resident senior fellow with Resources for the Future. He joined RFF, Resources for the Future, after spending more than 30 years with the U.S. Forest Service Research and Development Program. And most recently, he was a senior research scientist and leader of national and regional resource assessments. So with that, I think I'm just going to let Dr. Ware speak for himself, and looking forward to hearing what he has to present to us. Thank you. There you are.
Thank you, Danelle. I assume you all can hear me?
You're sounding good, looking good, sounding good.
Okay, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be batting cleanup in this lineup of speakers. I'm guessing that analogy is reflecting my my baseball deprivation, which I'm sure some of you are experiencing as well. I thought I'd give you just a little bit of background on Resources for the Future, who I am now affiliated with and really happy to be working with. RFF is a think tank devoted exclusively to natural resource and environmental issues. In fact, it's the first think tank to be devoted to those issues, established back in the 1950s. The mission of the organization is to improve environmental, energy, and natural resource decisions through impartial economic research and policy engagement, with the big emphasis on impartial research, improving decisions. And to that end, I hope some of this information is useful for decisions that some of you may be facing down the line. My role here in this presentation is to take a quick look at the body of science around woody biomass energy, and in a sense, I'm going to provide a high elevation presentation that's necessarily low resolution, but I hope some of the ideas resonate at this scale. Next slide. So I want to talk in particular about wood bioenergy in the context of the in the context of these broader questions about the interaction between forests and climate, and in particular the climate change benefits of forest. As Brian alluded to, there's quite a bit of interest in the question around the extent to which forest product benefits, and that includes the use of renewable feedstocks for energy generation, interact with the forest carbon sink, forest and carbon in the ground and in the trees, and how that affects the overall carbon calculus of forest. And so the way that is paraphrased these days is carbon neutrality. And so that's the question of whether or not using forests in a product sense, and especially for woody biomass, leads to a net reduction in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And science has taken a crack at trying to understand that from a number of different angles. And part of what I want to do today is just provide a taxonomy of the kinds of studies that are out there and what they say about woody biomass and carbon neutrality and the climate change benefits of forest. Next slide, please. So the first thing I think one needs to consider is that the questions that we're asking here are not strictly in the realm of science knowledge generation. Science can be conducted at various scales, from a really fine-grained plot level to a full-blown general equilibrium global level. But what we're asking here are real questions at the science policy interface. And so when we look at individual disciplinary studies, let's say a biological study or an engineering study, those may not directly translate to the questions that are especially relevant to to this particular set of concerns about using wood for bioenergy. I argue, and I think my colleagues would agree, that any useful analysis for addressing this question has to include a synthesis of all of these scientific disciplines. I mean, at a minimum, the biological side of things that define how forests sequester carbon or pull carbon from the atmosphere and store it in biomass and soils, along with an engineering perspective that includes things like the energy content of wood versus alternatives, the life cycle analysis that would include alternative emission profiles for various materials or feedstocks used in energy generation. And then finally, and I think especially important, is economics. So that the real question is, how do markets that place a value or increase the value of raw material coming from forests affect resource decisions and affect land use decisions? And it turns out that in the end is the crux of some of the findings that we see in the literature. Next slide. So I tend to divide the scientific literature into two broad categories. And the first category is the prospective analysis of woody biomass and energy features. What I mean by prospective analysis is we would use ex ante in the ivory tower, but really we're talking about a forecasting exercise. We're asking the question, if we introduce the use of woody biomass energy and we compare that with a future without woody biomass energy, how is that going to change the carbon footprint of the landscape, and most importantly, the carbon content of the atmosphere? And if we look across the literature, these studies have been conducted at multiple scales. We have biological studies that have focused on stand level forest dynamics, where we look at the cycling on a given acre. So an accumulation of forest over time followed by a harvest. And so the carbon accumulates over time and then falls off as a good part of it is removed in a final harvest, and then accumulates again over time. So that gives you a sort of a cycling approach. Landscape level analysis begins to look at the entire forested landscape and accounts for how changes in many stands over time affect the total carbon dynamics. But then the models that really get at the policy question, that are relevant to the questions at that science policy interface, or what I would call integrated market modeling, that accounts for forest dynamics, but also the land use decisions that are driven by the markets, and then the product substitution that's likely to occur due to the introduction of a new market or a new product. These integrated market models address policy questions. And if we look across the literature, and Brian alluded to some of these studies in his presentation, if we look across the literature of these IMMs, and I count 5 that are especially relevant to the United States, they all share the same finding, and that is that woody biomass energy is expected to be carbon neutral or even carbon positive, in the sense that one could have even more carbon sequestered in the landscape over time as a result of encouraging land use change. For example, the shifting of marginal cropland toward forest uses and actually expanding the forest estate over time. But as I like to think about prospective analyses and forecasting models, not as just some mechanism for telling us what the future might look like. I mean, there's a famous line that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And I think that applies here in the sense that we don't expect to be very precise about the future, because a lot of things will happen that we don't know about, the unknown unknowns, if you will. But I see them as mechanisms for generating working hypotheses about how we expect the world to work, how we expect the forest sector to work, and The key working hypotheses that come out of this is the key finding: woody biomass energy would lead to carbon neutral and carbon positive outcomes. And also, as a subset of that, an important hypothesis is that these strong product markets would actually expand forest land use, and the land use change mechanisms that I've already mentioned. Next slide, please. And we've, again, looked at this through many models. And I would recommend, if you're not familiar with this kind of analysis, to look on RFF's website. I think you can Google RFF bioenergy explainer and get to something that gives a really concise summary of these big ideas about carbon neutrality and markets and the like. But if you look at the graph to the left, and this is really a hypothetical situation where 1 unit of coal is displaced by 1 unit of wood bioenergy, and we have a forest type that accumulates over a 30-year period to its maximum. You can see that switching from coal to wood gives a strong net reduction in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide. It's important to remember that in addition to emission reductions in each year, that the thing that affects climate the most is the accumulation of emissions. And so that replacing a non-renewable with a renewable leads to an accumulation of benefits over time, a very strong impact. Next slide, please. The other part of the literature, I said I like to divide it into two. So instead of prospective analyses looking at empirical studies that actually look at the history of change in forest carbon over time. And that gives us some insights into those working hypotheses. Next slide, please. Here's a summary of what's happening in the U.S. Forests in the U.S., as Brian mentioned, we have to account for harvesting as well as accumulation through growth and photosynthesis. But if we look net at all of those changes, forests in the U.S. have been capturing emissions for several decades. And forest carbon is a growing asset, and it expands by about 0.5% per year. But if you look at that in comparison to the emissions from the rest of the economy, that's greater than 10% of emissions, closer to 15% of emissions from the transportation and the energy sectors. So it's very much a consequential contribution. If we looked at all inventories, those are about 52 times the annual emissions of greenhouse gases in the United States. So that it is a consequential sink. Next slide. This shows some trends. If we look at the top graph, it shows the amount of carbon that is pulled out of the atmosphere. So this is the positive change in that stock of carbon in U.S. forests. Note that it's been fairly stable. It increased from 2005 to 2012 or so, and has been on a level plane. The bottom graph highlights that a large majority of sequestration, that's the net of all the changes, those are the yellow bars, a vast majority is in the eastern United States, where most of our harvesting is located. So right now it's about 80% of carbon sequestration in the United States is on the forests of the eastern portion of our country. Next slide. Part of that's explained by differences in ownership and age class. So if we look at the age class distribution across ownerships in different regions, you can see that in the South and the North, especially in the South, we have a much greater portion of our forest in young ages that are accumulating carbon much more rapidly, and reflects the increase in forest area in these areas. Next slide. I would point out that timber harvesting in the United States peaked in the late 1990s, so that We are no longer producing at record levels of timber production. Latest statistics indicate we're about 20% below that peak, while timber supplies have expanded over that time due to investment, so that there is room to increase production within the historical range of variability. Next slide. And finally, I cap it off with a look at the South. This is the most intensive forest production region in the South. If we look at these lines that are started at 1, the yellow line is the timberland area. It's remained relatively stable since the 1950s, but that's in spite of increased urbanization. So more than 20 million acres of forest have been transitioned to urban area at the same time that about 20 million acres of agricultural land has been shifted to forest cover. So in that area, if you look at the blue line, we see that biomass has increased while harvesting has increased at roughly the same rate over time. And that's explained by an increase in planting forest, the gray line, a substantial increase in the area of planted forest in the South. Next slide. So this working hypothesis is that woody biomass energy can build the forest carbon sink. We've seen it work in the South with pulpwood and OSB feedstocks, encouraging and providing incentives to retain and add forests, incentives to expand productivity, so we're growing more biomass and carbon, and can be a mechanism for providing revenues for forest fuel reduction, something I haven't talked about here. Next slide. And so to conclude, I think the ultimate question is, what happens when we increase the utilization of wood energy? And our historical precedent, if we look at the South, where we had an increase in the demand for low quality material, is that we will see an increase in forest area, enhanced growth, and an expansion of the forest carbon stock, and indeed carbon neutrality. And it provides an intriguing mechanism for perhaps reducing wildfire emissions in the Western United States. But I'll conclude with that. Next slide. As I mentioned, we have some materials at RFF on these topics. If you type RFF bioenergy into your search engine, you should be able to find some expanded versions of this material. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ware. I wish that we could have had more time for all of our panelists today. I feel like we only got the tip of the iceberg for what everyone had to say. And unfortunately, we're going to have that experience again with our questions here. Thank you to everyone who has put questions into the Q&A and been jotting them down as we go along. We are not going to be able to answer all of these questions in the next 11 minutes, but I'm going to try to pick a few that I think might help elicit the most, kind of what our panelists have the most expertise in here. And as you've been seeing in the chat window, we will follow up with written answers, a transcript with written answers to all of the questions that we received. So if you're registered for today's webinar, you'll receive that follow-up. So I'm going to start with a question that I think may be at the top of a lot of people's minds, which gets right to the heart of this question of the time lag with bioenergy. The questioner says, the latest IPCC findings and requirements to achieve the needed carbon reductions to keep us below 1.5 degrees Celsius indicates that we need to be acting urgently in a 10 to 20 year time frame, not 50 years. So doesn't that mean we should be doing the calculations on net carbon impacts of biomass generated electricity using that 10 to 20 year time frame, not the 50 year time frame? So to me, this question is asking, yes, there's a time lag, and that might really matter. Dr. Ware, would you be in a position to comment on that, and then maybe Brian would also have something to add?
I think the short answer is that it matters in the short run as well as the long run. Though we're talking about a need to reduce the accumulated emissions of carbon dioxide on net. And the sooner we do it, the sooner you make a switch, the more emission reductions you'll have over time. And so the interaction with the atmosphere is accumulated, is an accumulative relationship, and I think that's important. I think it's important to act early. Yeah.
Brian, is there anything you want to add to that answer?
Just that I agree with what Dave was saying about it matters from both the short term and the long term, and that the forests are inherently a long-term endeavor, and changes in market structures that affect forest extent and can incentivize additional gains in the inventory in trees, whether it's newly planted trees or through expanding the inventory we already have. We need to be looking at all those different options, given the challenges that we're facing in terms of global emissions. Yeah.
Right, thank you. The next question I'm going to bring to the fore, what does the emissions reduction curve look like if we're replacing natural gas with woody biomass compared to the coal replacement curve that was shown in the presentation?
So I don't have that curve calculated, but the studies that we've done in the past shows that the benefits to replacing coal are greater than the benefit to replacing natural gas, but they are still significant and consequential. And I might add that they do follow the same pattern. It's a cumulative relationship.
Okay, great.
And I'll just add, in my presentation, this is Brian, I did show a scenario just for thermal where we're not replacing coal in a thermal scenario, because by and large people aren't using coal to produce heat for industrial processes or in houses. Mm-hmm. So there are immediate benefits in the scenario that I showed in terms of comparison to natural gas.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. Wade, this question was specifically directed to you. Are you still with us, Wade?
Oh, yeah.
Great. You suggested that biomass is not a likely choice for utilities. What about co-firing with coal in existing coal-fired power plants?
I think it is a very interesting and intriguing idea. The only thing I would say is, again, from an economic standpoint, who's going to make the decision to go forward with the idea? And again, it's the uncertainty of the permitting, because one of the words in there is coal. Mm-hmm. And there is no certainty that it may extend the life of a coal-fired power plant. But I can tell you the conversation in Maryland and the conversation in the United States, it's to take more coal out of service, not to keep it going, not to add to it. So me personally, I would be, it would be an intriguing idea to run down the road. But as a person in the business context, I don't see anybody trying it. There's again, certainty of getting a permit versus doing something else is a major league factor. So. Yeah. But I think it's an intriguing idea. I just don't see it happening.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great, thank you. While we have you off mute, Wade, I think these next two questions, I'm going to combine two into one, are sort of for you. How is the Maryland Department of Commerce working with the Maryland Energy Administration to promote woody biomass other than wood stoves? And does the Department of Commerce or any other Maryland agency have any grants to support the adoption of biomass energy solutions?
I'll start with the second part first. That would be MEA has those. And I believe in Gary Amee and Brandon, I can't remember Brandon's last name off the top of my head, They know more about that. But I do believe we have planning and capacity grants at MEA to help you design your project, to see what your opportunities are. And then we also have, MEA has a program where we can match up to 50% of your capital investment into the project. For the first part of the question, I serve on the review panels for those grants with MEA. And the way we look at it as Commerce is, MEA is like an internal customer to me. And so trying to help them get projects to the finish line, that's part of my job responsibility. Just as I have external customers, MEA is one of my internal customers. And the conversations we're having is, again, back to that point I brought up about having a champion. How do we, one of the biggest problems when we finally get a project to the finish line, about to sign and get going, the leader of the community college, the leader of the university, the leader of the office park, they leave. Now you have to educate somebody else who, you know, you have a short-term capital outlay for a long-term benefit. And when people are moving jobs and looking at from a career standpoint, it's a challenge. And so we are having conversations about how do you incentivize that champion of a project and trying to get those to the finish line. But it's a mitigatable issue, but it's a real issue. Those are the kinds of conversations we have.
Yeah, all right. Thank you for that. And our behind the scenes moderators remind us that sessions 4 and 5 in this series are really going to take a deeper dive into financing strategies and sort of all the intricacies on the journey of financing and seeing a project through to completion. We just have a couple more minutes. I'm going to end with a question that I think, you know, a lot of people, particularly if they're strong advocates for forests and are new to this, this arena, might have, which is, if we go all in on wood, are we going to create new scarcity? Are we going to take a forests that have a lot of new growth, a lot of room, and actually create a new scarcity? And Ann Hairston-Strang made a comment on that in the Q&A, but I wanted to give our panelists a chance to comment on that before we wrap up.
I would take a stab at it.
Yes, please.
Over the last 40 years, we've seen a very strong shift in the United States away from the liquidation of old growth or the mining of old growth resources to an agricultural style of forest management, so that we have a strongly renewable resource base. You know, we produce more wood than any other country in the world. We consume more wood than any other country in the world. Right now, we see growing supplies with diminished harvesting as the per capita consumption of wood product has declined in the United States, and Capita isn't growing that fast. So there's room for additional production within the current supply-demand frame. But also we see that strong markets can encourage land use to switch into forest uses, and that's been demonstrated empirically, and there's room for that. So that we should expect that supply can respond. It's important that the demand signals, the prices, indicate some certainty about the future to get that kind of investment. I think we've seen it demonstrated.
All right, we are going to have to end our Q&A session there. I wish we had more time, but we will be getting a transcript of the Q&A addressing the questions that didn't get answered. Sabrina or Monique, I don't know if you want to go back. I know I skipped the live polling question. If you want to go back and let people answer that poll, is it too late to do that? And while you're responding to that, we'll just say thank you again for participating today. I hope that today's session did impact your thinking in some ways that were of value to you. Thank you to all of our panelists for your thoughtful remarks and the time and effort that you put into participating here. Sorry that we couldn't all be together, but we will hope to keep this conversation going. Please do respond to the survey page when you close your Zoom window. We really appreciate having your feedback. And please do join us for additional sessions. Share your experience here with others. It's not too late for them to register for upcoming sessions or to go back and view a recording of a session that's already happened. And finally, I just want to mention that in addition to all of the resources that our panelists mentioned today and that you may want to connect with, this project has also produced a white paper as part of the Spurring Fossil Fuel Biomass Initiative, and that can be found on the Maryland Clean Energy website along with information about this webinar series. With that, we are concluded. Thank you again for your participation. I hope everyone has a great day.